Hello, and welcome to part one of drugs and the nervous system. This is for lesson one, brain basics. Um, we will be talking about the nervous system and how it's organized, as well as some structures and functions of those structures in the brain in this video. And then in a second part two video, we'll talk more in detail about neurons and neurotransmission and also how drugs can affect the brain. I suspect that many of you are probably familiar with the basics of the brain, especially if you're a psychology major. So my intention is to focus really on the sort of providing a refresher and then also highlighting any content that's relevant for the understanding of drugs and human behavior. So the nervous system is organized into two major components. There's the central nervous system, which is comprised of the brain and spinal cord, and then the peripheral nervous system, which involves the sensory and motor nerves throughout the body. And those nerves send information through the spinal cord up to the brain, and then the brain transmits information back down. And it's important that this is not a hierarchy. You'll see on the next slide that it looks like we're saying that the central nervous system perhaps is more important in some way than the peripheral nervous system. But in reality, both of these systems are essential to the way that we experience the world around us. You'll see this kind of breaks down the nervous system, particularly the peripheral nervous system, a little bit further. So in terms of our movements, we have voluntary and involuntary movements that happen throughout our body. And the voluntary movements would include things like running, walking, versus involuntary or autonomic movements, things like breathing, heart rate, etc. Those involuntary movements, that involuntary nervous system, is then even further subdivided into the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. So the sympathetic nervous system is your fight or flight response. So that's the activating, energizing arousal of the autonomic nervous system. It increases your heart rate, it increases your breathing. That's to prepare you to engage in some kind of survival or protective mechanism. Versus the parasympathetic nervous system, which is much more about returning to homeostasis. So returning to equilibrium, returning to that sort of even keel neutral place. So slowing down the heart rate, slowing down the breathing. And the way that I remember this is the parasympathetic nervous system is like the paramedics coming in after a crisis to calm and help everyone calm down. And so that's how I remember that the parasympathetic nervous system is about rest and digestion and these sort of calm activities of the body versus the sympathetic response, which is this energizing fight or flight response. So we're going to talk about the brain in terms of three main areas. We're going to talk about the hindbrain, the midbrain, and the forebrain. And those are organized 1, 2, 3 for a reason. So the order of these major areas of the brain relates to the order in which they evolved over time in humans as a species. So beginning with the hindbrain at the base of the skull, then moving into this midbrain towards the center of the brain, and then the forebrain sort of at the top towards the crown of the head. That's the order in which these parts of our brain developed across our evolutionary history. So as we got more sophisticated, these brain areas evolved further. And so having said that, when we're talking about the hindbrain, we're talking about a very sort of reptilian, sometimes it's called the reptile part of our brain, the alligator brain, the really most basic level of functioning is what this part of the brain is in charge of. And we'll talk about three components in particular: the medulla oblongata, the cerebellum, and the pons. And you can see those illustrated here, that this is an area of the brain that's associated with the brain stem as well as the cerebellum. And this is sort of at the nape of the neck is where you would find these parts of the brain. So within the hindbrain, the medulla oblongata is located immediately above the spinal cord. So it's the most basic part of the brain. And this controls our most essential functions in the body. So breathing, heart rate, vomiting, swallowing, so the acts of getting food in and getting poison out, blood pressure, regulating digestion. I mean, these things are essential to the way that we live, essentially. And when there are disruptions to the medulla oblongata in the form of either an injury or, in the context of this course, certain drugs, then they're fatal. I mean, this is an area of the brain that if you do not have this part of the brain functioning properly, you are not surviving. And alcohol is an example of that. And we'll, as the semester unfolds, we'll talk in more depth about how these drugs impact these different parts of the brain, and what effect that has on us as humans. Another part of the hindbrain is the cerebellum. This is located in towards the back of the head, in this diagram to the right of the medulla oblongata. The cerebellum is responsible for motor control, and in particular balance, such as in walking and in speech. And so drugs that affect this part of the brain will affect your balance and your speech. So when you're looking at someone engaged in a sobriety test and trying to walk the line for the police officer, if their balance is impaired, it means that there's some sort of drug, perhaps, or an injury impacting their cerebellum. And this is also where you would start to hear people slur their speech or have trouble communicating. And that's because some substance or an injury is impacting that part of the brain. And alcohol, again, is a type of drug that we'll talk about in more detail. It has a whole lesson dedicated to it. But that substance affects the cerebellum. And then a third important component of the hindbrain is the pons. And this is the part of the brain that really allows information and to move from the spinal cord up through the rest of the brain. And its function is really this kind of information channel, to get information from the rest of the body to the brain and vice versa. And within the pons, there's a subcomponent called the reticular activating system, which is responsible for our alertness and our arousal in the physiological sense. So how is that sympathetic nervous system activated? How is the parasympathetic nervous system activated? And there's some evidence that this part of the brain system is involved in ADHD in terms of that alertness and in that attention being given towards a particular task. And the reticular activating system is affected by both tranquilizers, which tend to have a more depressing kind of effect on the nervous system, and also responds to stimulants, which have a more activating and more energizing effect on the nervous system. So it's here that you see the part of the brain that's in charge of at least some elements of that nervous system, that sympathetic nervous system, parasympathetic nervous system arousal is happening here in the pons. Moving up in terms of evolutionary history and also in terms of sophistication, we have the midbrain. So this is at the very top of the I'm sorry, the brain stem, excuse me. So at the very top of the brain stem is the midbrain. And this part of the brain has three components: the inferior cochlea, the superior cochlea, and the substantia nigra. So this is an area of the brain that is moving up in sophistication. So we're starting to talk about vision. We're starting to talk about hearing. We're starting to talk about some reward elements. These are sort of more sophisticated types of behaviors. But we're not quite at that super advanced level. So the inferior cochlea is responsible for auditory reflexes. So um, attending to and processing auditory stimulation, but not at a conscious level. So this is just the most basic audio in level of processing happening here in the midbrain. Same with vision. So in the superior cochlea, the vision reflex is located here. But again, that's not the perception of sight. You wouldn't, at this part of the brain, recognize that you are seeing something, but it is at a non-conscious level, focusing on an image or making sure that the light that's getting from the eyeball to the brain is being processed at a subconscious level. And then this part of the brain is also responsible for the rewards and movement. When things are pleasurable or rewarding to us, this part of the brain, the substantia nigra, is activated. Also, when we're moving or we're engaged in movement, the cerebellum is one part of the brain responsible for that. Another is the substantia nigra part of the brain located in the midbrain. And that's because this part of the brain has a lot of dopamine receptors. And we'll talk in the second part of this lecture what dopamine is, how it functions, why it's important. But it is connected to that reward system, and it is connected to our ability to manage and control our movements. And so for this reason, the substantia nigra is also implicated in something like Parkinson's disease, where there is a disruption in the smooth movement or voluntary movement that you might see in healthy individuals. And this is relevant for our discussion of drugs that are coming later in the semester, because there are certain drugs, for example, inhalants that kill neurons in this part of the brain. So it's sort of slowly destroying this part of the brain, which is going to have a big impact on the way that we experience pleasure and the way that we're moving, or the sort of voluntary or involuntary movements that we're able to engage in. And then last but certainly not least is the forebrain. This is the sort of most advanced upper portion of the human brain. You can see here it is the sort of bulkiest, largest part of the brain. And we're going to talk about it in terms of 5 structures. So beginning with the thalamus, which is located closest to the midbrain. You'll see it in the diagram in purple in the center of the diagram. This is a part of the brain that really routes information that's coming up through the brain stem into the rest of the brain. So moving that information that's at a more basic level into that level of conscious awareness, into that level of more sophisticated processing. The thalamus really kind of transmits information all around the brain that's coming in from the brain stem. And then similarly, you have the hypothalamus. They're located pretty close to each other. And the hypothalamus is regulating body functions in the other direction. So the brain is sending information through the hypothalamus, which is then regulating things like breathing, heart rate, etc., through the rest of the body. Also located here, moving again more sophisticated, is the limbic system. And this is composed of 2 subcomponents, the amygdala and the hippocampus. And the limbic system really is in charge of the sort of most basic form of our emotions and the most basic form of our memories. There are other parts of the brain that are implicated in these functions of experiencing emotion and remembering things, but the amygdala and the hippocampus are the primary structures responsible for these activities. That's in the limbic system. And then again, moving outward, we have the basal ganglia, which is very closely related to that midbrain structure I was mentioning a moment ago. This is also related to reward and movement. And so the substantia nigra and the basal ganglia, you can see, are actually very, very close to each other and are often talked about as being a similar or even the same area of the brain. And so again, you're going to find concentrations of dopamine receptors there too, and we'll talk more about what that means in a little bit. Moving up, we have the cerebral cortex. This is the part of the brain that's responsible for almost all of our higher order functions. And this is where we'll talk in a moment about just the most sophisticated types of thinking and experiencing the world. That's what's happening in the cerebral cortex. It's the most recent in our evolutionary history to evolve, and therefore it's the most sophisticated. It's what separates us the most from other animals. And then again, last but not least, we have the nucleus accumbens. So this is the section of the brain that's not pictured here, but I will go over it in more detail in a moment. This is an important part of the brain in terms of regulating our reward and our pleasure. So our experience of something that is enjoyable to us, something that feels good to us, and therefore we find it rewarding and we want to do more of it. And so the nucleus accumbens plays a major role when it comes to the way that we experience drugs and in the process of addiction. So to break it down a bit further, I was talking about the cerebral cortex as being the most advanced, the most evolved part of our brain, and it can be split into these four lobes. The occipital lobe, located at the back of the head, the back of the skull, this is responsible for vision. So often when someone hits the back of their head very hard, they might see stars or have blurred vision. That's because that's the occipital lobe right there at the back of the head that's being injured temporarily. The temporal lobes are on the side of the head. They're pictured here in teal. This is involved with hearing, but then also because this part of the cerebral cortex is butt up against sections of the limbic system and the midbrain, you also have the processing of emotions here in the temporal lobe. So again, remembering back that the limbic system involves the amygdala and the hippocampus. So there's some memory and some learning and some emotional processing. So that you're getting a little bit of that in the temporal lobe, as well as processing hearing because it's also close to your ears. The frontal lobe is located towards the forehead, the front of the brain, and this is a major, major player in terms of our human behavior. It's processing the most higher order functions that we have. It's involved in almost everything we do: movement, emotionality, intelligence, like planning, managing impulsivity, or engaging in any kind of behavior control. So deciding not to punch someone or deciding to refrain from eating something that you don't want to eat because you're on a diet or something like that. That's all happening in the frontal lobe. It's also where a majority of our personality is coming from. And then in between, sort of towards not quite the front, not quite the back, but at the top of the skull is the parietal lobe. And this is responsible for processing touch. So the sensation of touch all throughout the body is processed there in the parietal lobe. And then the nucleus accumbens, the last part of the forebrain that we'll talk about, is located in blue on this diagram. And so it's at a part of the frontal lobe that is close to the temporal lobe. And again, remembering that the frontal lobe is how we experience sort of conscious, effortful planning type behaviors and choices and managing impulsive behaviors, and the temporal lobe being responsible for our experiences of not just hearing, but also emotion. And there's some memory thrown in there. There's this smaller part of the brain located in between these two lobes called the nucleus accumbens. And this is the reward and pleasure center of our brain. It is saturated in dopamine, and when it's released, dopamine is released throughout the brain when that part of the brain is stimulated. It's sent from that section of the brain to the prefrontal cortex or the frontal cortex, which is involved in, again, that conscious recognition of our experience of reward and pleasure. So saying, oh, I enjoyed that, or I liked that, or give me some more of that. As well as our behavioral control. So, ooh, I liked that, but this maybe isn't the right time, so I need to not do that. So, yes, I really enjoyed eating that chocolate, but I decided that I was not going to have chocolate after 5 o'clock because the caffeine affects my sleep, so I'm not going to have chocolate. So, that whole process of experiencing something rewarding, recognizing that it's rewarding, and then engaging and deciding either to continue doing it or to stop doing it, that's all happening in the nucleus accumbens. And so, my question to you, part of the lecture question for lesson 1, is why would this area of the brain be implicated in something like an addiction or a substance use disorder? And that's what you'll be answering for lesson 1 lecture question.